It's a Saturday afternoon in 1934. 125th Street in Harlem is alive, the way only Harlem knows how to be alive. Women in church hats, men in pressed suits, children weaving between adults' legs, the smell of fried fish drifting out of a corner window, jazz bleeding through the walls of a nearby club even though it's barely noon. This is the cultural capital of Black America, and everyone knows it. But look closer. Walk into that grocery store on the corner. Notice the man behind the register, white. Walk into the pharmacy next door, the pharmacist, white. The clothing shop, the jewelry store, the five and dime, white, white, white. Now look at who's spending money in all these stores. Black. Almost entirely black. Harlem in 1934 is a neighborhood of about 300,000 black residents packed into a few dozen blocks on the northern tip of Manhattan. They are customers, they are tenants, they are the economic engine of this entire district, and yet somehow almost none of them are employees. In a neighborhood where black people make up 70% of the population, black workers hold fewer than 10% of the jobs in the stores lining their own streets. Think about that for a second. You walk into your neighborhood store, you hand over your money, and the people taking that money won't hire anyone who looks like you. Now ask yourself, what would you do? Here's what Harlem did. They didn't riot, they didn't burn anything down, they didn't ask politely and wait. They did something that the store owners never saw coming, something so disciplined, so organized, so strategically precise, that it would eventually change the laws of New York State, reshape how America thinks about economic justice, and quietly lay the groundwork for every boycott movement that came after it. They simply stopped buying. But here's the question that nobody asks, the question that makes this story so much bigger than a boycott. How do 300,000 people, living in poverty, with no political power and no legal protection, win a fight against an entire economic system that was designed to keep them out? Stay with me, because the answer will surprise you. Before we get into the fight, you need to understand what Harlem actually was. Because people today sometimes think of Harlem as just a neighborhood, a zip code, a dot on a Manhattan map. But in the 1920s and 1930s, Harlem was something else entirely. Harlem was an idea. It was the center of the Harlem Renaissance, arguably the most significant explosion of black art, music, literature, and intellectual thought that America had ever seen. Langston Hughes wrote poetry here, Duke Ellington played here, Zara Nulla Huston published here, Muckers Gover organized here, W.E.B. Du Bois argued here. The NAACP had its offices here. The Urban League operated here. Black newspapers, like the Amsterdam News, reached hundreds of thousands of readers from here. If you were black in America in 1930, Harlem was proof that black people could build something extraordinary, even inside a system that was rugged against them. But here's the painful irony at the heart of this story. The same Harlem Renaissance that was dazzling the world, that was producing art and music and literature that white America would consume and copy and profit from for the next century, was happening on top of a foundation of severe economic exclusion. Black Harlemites were among the most culturally influential people in America, and among the most economically exploited. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black Americans north, fleeing the violence and terror of the Jim Crow South. They came to New York with hope, and New York, technically outside the South, technically without legal segregation, still found ways to keep black workers out of nearly every decent job. The department stores wouldn't hire black salespeople. The transit authority had strict quotas. The utility companies almost never hired black workers. And in Harlem itself, in the very neighborhood built by black culture and sustained by black dollars, the local businesses ran almost entirely on black customers while almost entirely excluding black workers. This was the contradiction that was about to explode. And what made this particular fight so dangerous and so extraordinary, is that the people who started it had almost nothing. No political party backing them, no friendly governor, no sympathetic police force. What they had was each other, and a single, radical idea. If our money is good enough for your store, our people are good enough for your payroll. What he saw happening in his neighborhood, he would later become one of the most powerful congressmen in American history. But in 1934, he was 26 years old and looking for a fight. The Reverend John H. Johnson, pastor of St. Martin's Episcopal Church, and one of the key organizers who saw the economic argument more clearly than almost anyone. If black consumers were the lifeblood of Harlem commerce, they had power they weren't using. Sufi Abdul Hamid a flamboyant, controversial street organizer who had actually started running informal boycotts of Harlem stores as early as 1931. Hamid was polarizing. He wore a cape and a turban. Some in the community loved him, others, including many mainstream black leaders, were deeply suspicious of him. His methods were loud and sometimes inflammatory, but he planted the seed. And then there were the organizations. The Citizens League for Fair Play, the New York Coordinating Committee for Employment *, neighborhood associations, church groups, block clubs, dozens of them, pulling in different directions, sometimes fighting each other as much as the stores they were targeting. This is important, because the boycott movement in Harlem wasn't a single, unified campaign with a clear leader. It was messy, it was fractured, it was human. And that messiness, that internal conflict, would nearly sink the whole thing before it ever got started. Meanwhile, the store owners on 125th Street were watching all of this with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They had lawyers, they had insurance, they had relationships with the police, they had operated this way for decades. They were not worried. They should have been. The phrase that launched everything was almost insultingly simple. Don't buy where you can't work. It had been used in other cities, Cleveland, Chicago, Washington, D.C., with some success. But Harlem was different. Harlem was denser, more organized, more culturally influential. And by the early 1930s, a critical mass of people were angry enough to act. The campaign started with individual stores. Organizers would walk into a business on 125th Street, document how many employees were black, usually 0 or 1, and then present the owner with a simple demand: hire black workers in proportion to your black customer base. Most owners refused. So the picket lines went up. Here's what that looked like. Men and women, dressed neatly, deliberately, because they understood that appearance mattered, would stand in front of a store carrying signs. They'd hand out leaflets to Pescasba. They'd ask, politely, firmly, that people not shop there today. And people listened. Within weeks of the first major picket, on 125th Street, sales at targeted stores dropped dramatically. One estimate suggested some stores lost 40% of their business within a month. The store owners did what powerful people always do when they're surprised and threatened. They pushed back hard. Some called the police. Officers would show up, sometimes harass picketers, sometimes arrest them on dubious charges of blocking the sidewalk. The organizers learned quickly, don't block the sidewalk, keep moving, stay within the law. Some owners went to court, seeking injunctions to shut down the pickets entirely. And here is where the story takes its first shocking turn. In 1935, a New York court granted exactly that, an injunction banning the picket lines. The legal argument was that the boycott organizers had no direct employment relationship with the stores they were targeting, and therefore couldn't legally picket them under existing labqi law. Think about what that means. The law said, you can only protest your own employer. You can't protest a business that simply refuses to hire anyone who looks like you. The movement had just hit a wall. And not just a practical wall, a legal one, with a court order behind it. For a lesser movement, this would have been the end. But here's what the organizers understood that the store owners didn't. Shutting down the picket lines didn't bring back the customers. The black community of Harlem didn't need a picket sign to remind them not to shop somewhere. They knew, and they kept not shopping. Meanwhile, inside the movement, a different kind of conflict was brewing. The more moderate leaders, people connected to the Urban League, to established churches, to the NAACP, were increasingly uncomfortable with Sufi Abd al-Hamid and his fiery street rhetoric. Hamid had a gift for drawing crowds, but his speeches sometimes veered into anti-Semitic territory, targeting Jewish store owners specifically rather than the practice of exclusion generally. This was toxic, and the mainstream movement knew it. There were also accusations of corruption, claims that some organizers were taking payments from store owners to make picket lines disappear. The community was watching, and they were skeptical. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. saw the danger clearly. If the movement fractured along these lines, moderate versus radical, credible versus controversial, it would lose the moral authority that was its only real weapon. He made a decision. He stepped in and essentially took over. Not through force, through persuasion, organization, and the sheer force of his own reputation and platform. Powell pulled the movement under the umbrella of Abyssinian Baptist Church and its network. He recruited the more credible organizations, sidelined the most controversial voices, and reframed the campaign in explicitly moral terms, not as an attack on any ethnic group, but as a demand for justice and human dignity. He also did something strategically brilliant. He went to the newspapers. March 19, 1935, a Tuesday afternoon. A 16-year-old Puerto Rican boy named Lino Obvero was caught shoplifting a pocket knife from the Crus 5 and Dime store on 125th Street. Store employees grabbed him. There was a scuffle. An ambulance was called, not because Obvero was seriously hurt, but to help transport him discreetly out of the store. But a rumor spread through the street outside. Someone said the boy had been beaten to death by store employees. It wasn't true. Obvero was very much alive, but by nightfall that rumor had spread through all of Harlem. And 3 days of uprising followed. Stores were looted, windows shattered, 3 black men died in the chaos, shot by police, hundreds were arrested, millions of dollars in property damage. The Harlem riot of 1935 was not what the boycott movement wanted. Violence wasn't their strategy, it never had been, and many of the organizers were horrified. And this is where history gets complicated. The riot did something that 3 years of peaceful picket lines had not quite managed to do. It forced the city to pay attention. New York Mayor Paul LaGuardia, to his credit, responded seriously. He commissioned a full investigation into the conditions in Harlem, poverty, unemployment, police brutality, economic exclusion. The resulting report, written by a committee led by E. Franklin Fraser, one of the most important black sociologists of the 20th century, was extraordinarily detailed and damning. It documented exactly what the boycott organizers had been saying for years: systematic economic exclusion, the deliberate refusal to hire black workers in black neighborhoods, the exploitation of black consumers who had nowhere else to shop. LaGuardia buried the report. Actually, he didn't want to release it publicly because it was so critical of city governance, but copies leaked. The Amsterdam News got hold of it. It was printed, read, discussed. The moral argument was now backed by a government document. At the same time, something was shifting in the courts. Remember that injunction that had shut down the picket lines? The organizers appealed, and they kept appealing. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and the New York Coordinating Committee for Employment, the umbrella coalition Powell had helped build, brought in lawyers to argue a simple but radical point: racial discrimination in Harlem is not a private business matter. It is a public harm, and the people harmed by it have every right to protest it publicly. This argument worked its way through the court system slowly, painfully, the way legal arguments do. Meanwhile, Powell was building the pressure from every direction at once. He organized mass meetings at Abyssinian Baptist Church, meetings that drew thousands of people. He marched. He spoke on street corners. He held press conferences. He wrote newspaper columns. He put names and faces on the boycott, making it emotionally impossible for the city to ignore. He also did something that the store owners had not anticipated. He made the boycott aspirational. Supporting the boycott wasn't just about withholding money. It was about pride. It was about being part of something historic. It was about Harlem declaring publicly that it knew its own worth. Women's organizations joined. Churches joined. Fraternal organizations joined. The boycott became woven into the social fabric of the neighborhood. And then, in 1938, the New York Court of Appeals issued a ruling that would echo across American labor history. Blacks who were discriminated against in employment had the legal right to picket businesses that refused to hire them. Read that again. The court ruled that racial discrimination in Harlem created a legitimate labor dispute, and that therefore, the targets of that discrimination could legally picket the businesses practicing it. It was quite simply a revolution in the law. After the 1938 court ruling, the dam broke. Stores that had held out for years suddenly found themselves without a legal shield. The picket lines came back, this time with full legal protection. And this time, the broader coalition Powell had built was more organized, more disciplined, and more strategically unified than it had ever been. Store after store on 125th Street signed agreements. The Consolidated Edison Power Company, which serviced all of Harlem but had almost no black employees, eventually capitulated under sustained pressure. The New York Telephone Company, the Fifth Avenue coach bus lines. By 1941, the New York Coordinating Committee for Employment had negotiated the hiring of over 10,000 black workers in New York City alone. 10,000 jobs, real jobs, steady paychecks, in the middle of the Great Depression. That is not a symbolic victory, that is material change in people's daily lives. But the victory was messier than that number suggests, and it's worth being honest about the complications. First, some of the hiring was token, a few black faces in visible positions, while the actual power structures of these companies remained entirely white. The store owners had learned to perform integration without actually practicing it. Second, the movement fractured badly after its peak success. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. moved into electoral politics. He would be elected to the New York City Council in 1941, then to the United States Congress in 1944. His departure left the movement without its most galvanizing figure. Some of the coalition organizations that had worked together fell back into rivalry. Third, and this is the part that should make you uncomfortable, the economic integration of Harlem's commercial district did not stop the longer-term economic decline of the neighborhood. Redlining, discriminatory mortgage lending, urban renewal programs in the 1950s and 60s that demolished black neighborhoods in the name of development. These forces were bigger than any boycott. The 10,000 jobs were real, and they weren't enough. But here's what the victory did accomplish that no one fully understood at the time. It proved the model. It proved that organized, disciplined, sustained economic pressure, without a single act of violence, could force institutional change against a system designed to be unchangeable. And it built a generation of organizers, lawyers, and strategists who carried that lesson forward. When Bayard Rustin began organizing in the 1940s, he'd studied what happened in Harlem. When the Montgomery bus boycott launched in 1955, when Rosa Parks sat down and 40,000 black residents of Montgomery, Alabama refused to ride the bus for 381 days. The playbook they were running had been tested 2 decades earlier on 125th Street. The leaders of Montgomery knew about Harlem. They didn't always say so, but they knew. And there's one more consequence that almost no one talks about. The 1938 New York Court of Appeals ruling that racial discrimination in hiring creates a legitimate labor dispute was eventually cited in federal court cases. It worked its way, slowly and indirectly, into the thinking that would eventually produce the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned employment discrimination nationwide. A court ruling in New York in 1938, won by Harlem activists over a 5-and-dime store on 125th Street, contributed to the legal architecture that protects every American worker today. That's the hidden legacy of this fight. Walk down 125th Street today and you'll see a neighborhood that has changed dramatically, and in some ways, not at all. Harlem went through a massive wave of gentrification starting in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s. Longtime black residents were pushed out by rising rents. National chains moved in, Starbucks, Old Navy, The Gap. The cultural center of Black America became a destination for tourists and a home for higher-income newcomers. The irony is almost painful. The community that fought for decades to be included in Harlem's economy eventually found itself priced out of it. But the questions raised by the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign have never gone away. They're just wearing different clothes now. In 2023, studies still show that black unemployment in the United States runs roughly twice the rate of white unemployment, a gap that has remained almost constant for 60 years, despite civil rights legislation, despite diversity programs, despite decades of stated corporate commitment to inclusion. The mechanisms are different now. They're subtler, harder to photograph, harder to picket. But the outcome rhymes with 1934. The debate over whether economic boycotts work, whether consumer pressure can actually change corporate behavior, is more alive today than ever. When communities boycott companies over racial injustice, they're using a tool that was sharpened in Harlem. The moral logic is the same. The strategic debates are the same. Even the internal conflicts, moderate vs. radical, symbolic vs. systemic, are the same. And there's something else. The "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign was fundamentally an argument about the relationship between economic power and political power. It said, we may be excluded from politics, we may be excluded from power, but as long as we are consumers, we have leverage. And leverage, used correctly, is power. That idea that ordinary people can exercise power through collective economic action is one of the most radical and enduring ideas in American democratic life. It doesn't require wealth. It doesn't require political connections. It requires only discipline and solidarity. In a country where the levers of political power often feel impossibly distant, that idea matters. The people who stood on 125th Street in 1934, holding signs and asking their neighbors not to shop for one more day, they knew something that still takes people by surprise. You don't have to be powerful to use power, you just have to know where yours is. Let's go back to where we started. 125th Street, 1934, the smell of fried fish, the sound of jazz, 300,000 people living in the most culturally extraordinary neighborhood in America, watching their own money disappear into pockets that would never open for them. Here's what I want you to hold on to. The people who launched this fight were not famous, not yet. They were preachers and organizers and mothers and students and former sharecroppers who had come north looking for something better. They were tired. They were broke. They were operating in a city and a legal system that mostly didn't care whether they lived or died. And they won. Not completely, not permanently. History doesn't really work that way. But they won in ways that mattered: jobs, legal precedents, a model that would be borrowed and adapted and carried forward into the most important civil rights struggles of the 20th century. They won because they understood something simple and profound, that power isn't only held in legislatures and courthouses and corporate boardrooms. Power lives wherever people make collective decisions about how to spend their time, their money, and their energy. They also understood something about dignity. When you choose to withhold your money from someone who treats you as less than human, you're not just making an economic argument. You're making a statement about who you are. You're saying, I know my worth, and I will not let you use my own resources against me. That statement, made quietly, without violence, on a city sidewalk in 1934, echoed forward through Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma and every economic justice campaign that followed. The most powerful fight in Harlem's history happened without a single punch. And it changed America more than most battles ever have.